know that you're beyond a beginner basketball player? I'm Tony. Welcome back to Streetball Strategies.
There ain't no backing down, never crack, never fold. We from the gutter but need a crown. We pledge allegiance to the streets. We took the harder path, but now we finna.
Today's video is about understanding when you've crossed over from being a beginner basketball player to an intermediate basketball player. It's good to know where you are in that, basketball bell curve, right? Like at the beginning, there's a small percentage of players that are beginners. Like when you're a beginner, when you're starting to learn the game, alongside with you, there will be other players like in your area that are also beginners as well, but they're going to be a small percentage of people, right? When you become an intermediate player, right, now you're on that bell curve and there's a huge space with a huge large amount of people who are in that intermediate section of that bell curve. That's the vast majority of the people that you're going to encounter out here. And then on the other side of the bell curve, there's another small percentage of players who are the advanced players out here that you will encounter. But most players out here are casual players, right? They're not dialed into the game and their game the way we are, because they're only out here to have a good time and enjoy themselves. Well, while we're trying to do the same thing, but what makes this enjoyable for us is the process of trying to be the very best players we can be. And in order to do that, it's very important to know where you are on that curve, to know like what you still have to accomplish as a player. So today let's talk about how to know you've crossed over from being a beginner to an intermediate player. Now what you need to understand is when we're talking about outdoor recreational basketball, there is no real clear line between, okay, here you're a beginner, but then if you cross this imaginary line, you can do a certain amount of skills or abilities, now you're an intermediate player. It may be more clear in defining if you're talking about indoor actually organized players like high school and AAU. It may be easier to tell them, this player's beginner, and if you do this, if you have this set of skills and abilities, now you're an intermediate player. But out here, recreationally, there is no real defining way to decide that. So first of all, what we're talking about when we're trying to define what defines a beginner from an intermediate player, especially out here recreationally, we need to be comparing ourselves to the people, the players that we spend the most time around, competing with. Meaning like we shouldn't compare ourselves to like NBA players, because if NBA players fall into the advanced end of the bell curve, if like that's exclusively how you can be advanced, then how can we as outdoor recreational players, how can we ever, get to that advanced level? Like that would be impossible. If all we ever play is outdoor recreational basketball, then we're never going to be playing NBA basketball, which means we would never be advanced players. The other extreme example being like if you're in college, if you're college aged and you go to like a junior high school and play basketball against junior high school aged kids, well, to them, you're going to be advanced, even though, maybe to your own self, your own game, you still technically feel like a beginner, but to the junior high kids that you're playing against, they see you as being advanced. So what I mean is when you're trying to decide if you're beginner or intermediate, right, you need to compare yourself to the players you spend the most time playing around. Now, the way I like to think of it in terms of where you are in your career, how advanced you are, I like to picture it as like a basketball race. Hopefully this is like relatable to other players as well. In my mind, I've always thought about like, okay, if in terms of skill and ability, right, if you're running a basketball race against the players that you usually play with and against, right, in that race, do you feel like you're behind the vast majority of the players, or are you more even with them? Like, do you feel you're constantly playing catch up? Like they're constantly and consistently ahead of you and you're trying to catch up to them because they're just better than you? Is that the perception that you get from the experience of playing with and against them on a regular basis? Or do you feel like you're pretty even with them? Because like we established, most of the players out here are going to be in that intermediate, vast majority section of the bell curve. So do you feel like you're with them, or do you feel like you're constantly trying to chase them and catch up to them because you're behind them because you're a beginner and the majority of them are intermediate. Now you could be making the case that like you are intermediate and the people that you're playing with and against are advanced, and so of course you constantly feel like you're trying to catch up to them because they're in the small percentage of the end of the bell curve of being advanced players, and maybe you're intermediate or maybe you're still beginner. And so if you're constantly competing with and against advanced players, then of course you're always going to feel like you're trying to catch up to them. But like I said, that's unlikely. Like, of course, from time to time you are going to come across players who are in that advanced section of the bell curve, but the vast majority of the players out here that you're going to encounter are going to be intermediate. So making that assumption, do you feel like you're even with them, or do you feel like you're still trying to catch up to them? If you feel like you're still trying to catch up to them, and the more in front of you they seem to be, right, the more of a beginner you are. That's fine. And then the closer you get to them, and the more even you seem and feel to be with them, the more of an intermediate player you probably are. So now let's touch on the best and fastest way I think you can cross over from being a beginner to being intermediate. And understand that this advice is going to be pretty basic and it's going to be pretty obvious, but there's a very good reason for that. That reason being because when you're a beginner at anything, when you're doing anything for the first time, what makes learning whatever it is for the very first time as a beginner, what makes it difficult and seem to be very time consuming is the fact that it's the first time you're building neural pathways and muscle memory. If you've never thought about things in a certain way, if you've never moved a certain way, if you've never used muscles in a certain way, getting used to that, that's the difficult part. That's what takes such a long time. That's what requires the repetitions over and over and over again. It's not that what you're trying to learn is super complicated or sophisticated, meaning like, if it was, that's why it would take such a long time to learn. No, it's all basic stuff that you're trying to learn. But because you've never done it before and it's your very first time building those pathways and that muscle memory, that's the time consuming and difficult part about it. That being understood, my advice for the best and fastest way you can go from being a beginner to an intermediate player is by being self-aware, right? Knowing yourself, knowing your game, right? And the biggest part of that is knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are. And then you need to be super self-critical of your abilities. You need to be very honest and be aware of what your weaknesses are, what your worst weaknesses are. That's where you're going to spend the vast majority of your time practicing, training, working out your weaknesses. Because especially as a beginner, you don't have to really worry about what your strengths are, because you will naturally work on and improve and use your strengths in game and competition situations, which means you're going to get all the experience using your strengths that you're going to need. So off the court in practice, you're not going to have to put in extra time towards your strengths. But especially when you're a beginner and you're not good at stuff yet, right? You have weaknesses, you're going to shy away from doing things that you're not good at yet when it comes to like competition. You don't want to embarrass yourself by trying to do stuff that you're not good at yet, so you avoid doing it in game and in competition. And that's okay. You just have to put in time off the court and practice to try to bring your weaknesses up to try to match the strengths that you already have. Trying to become comfortable with those weaknesses, right? Getting so much better at them so that you're not uncomfortable with them anymore, so that in game, in competition, you will use those, what used to be weaknesses, now you're using them in game and competition, which means your game is growing, it's expanding, and your weaknesses are dwindling. Thus, as that process happens, your game gets better, right? And then as your game gets better, you close that gap in that basketball race so that now you feel closer and more even with the intermediate players. Again, it's basic and obvious advice, but it's also the most effective advice. Just because it's basic and obvious doesn't mean that it doesn't work. In fact, not only does it work, it is the best way to go about trying to cross that threshold. Last couple of thoughts in terms of crossing over from being a beginner to an intermediate player. And that is, I want to give you fair forewarning in terms of what to expect when you become an intermediate player. No matter where you are in your basketball career in terms of whether you're a beginner or you're intermediate, understand nothing's ever going to happen in terms of you improving. Nothing's ever going to happen as quickly or as easily or as effectively or efficiently as you would like it to. But it's not until you're intermediate that you understand when you're in that intermediate stage, that's where the real marathon happens. One of the best things about being a beginner is since you're learning and experiencing stuff for the very first time, that means you're also making constant progress. Now to you as the beginner, it's not going to feel that way. It's going to feel like it's taking forever, but the reality is on a weekly and especially monthly basis, you're going to be making pretty big leaps in your game. You're going to be making pretty good constant progress. And that's what makes that process fun and bearable, because if you're a beginner with anything and you're trying to learn and do something for the very first time and you're just not making any progress ever, it feels like or seems like, and it's been like months and months and you're pretty much the same as you were at the very beginning, well, of course you're going to give up eventually, because the part that makes, going from beginner to intermediate fun is the fact where you're making actual progress. And that's what happens when you put in hard, good, smart, consistent work out here on the basketball court. You will make that progress from a weekly and monthly basis. What'll happen is you'll come out here, right? It'll be like a game day. You'll spend the day competing and playing basketball. You will consider yourself a beginner at the beginning of that day. And then after that day, when the day's over and you go home and you're reflecting on how you played that day, maybe you took game tape and now you're studying and watching that game tape and you're reflecting on how you played that day, what you'll realize is, oh, I played pretty well that day. In fact, I played so well that it felt like I was pretty even with most of the players out there. I didn't feel like I was playing from behind and trying to catch them. This was the first time I really felt like, okay, I'm really even with them. Now, maybe that might be a fluke, right? Maybe you just had, an unusually good day. But what'll happen over and over again eventually is you'll have those kind of good days over and over again on a regular basis. When that happens, right, then you've just obviously crossed over from being a beginner to an intermediate player. But now that you're intermediate, what you're going to come to understand is now that you've built like the vast majority of your skill and your abilities, and you have a pretty decent level of experience underneath your belt, now the progress that you're going to be making in that intermediate section is going to be so much less. The majority of your game is already there. It's already built, right? So there is no more leaps and bounds in terms of progress, because your base, your foundation is already laid out. Now it's not nearly as much about building skills and abilities as it is sharpening them. And sharpening them is a much more subtle process, right? The progress that you will make in the intermediate section is so much smaller and so much more subtle that it takes such a longer time to work your way through that intermediate stage. That's why I refer to being intermediate as a marathon, because it's all about outlasting everybody else that's in that huge intermediate zone. Can you outlast everybody else? Can you still work harder for longer, more consistently, to surpass the huge amount of people in that intermediate zone? A lot of people will get into that intermediate zone and go, that's good enough. I worked hard to get to be an intermediate. Now that I'm here, this is good enough. This is where I'll settle. This is where I'll spend the rest of my career. And those players pretty much end up being casual players, the majority of players out here. Nothing wrong with making that decision, but this channel is of course dedicated to the hardcore players who are looking to be the very best basketball players they can be. That being said, everybody can get to an advanced stage in their career. It doesn't matter your talent or how tall you are or anything like that. It just depends on, do you actually want to be the very best player you can be, or are you going to settle from being just, you know, an intermediate player. So I want to thank you guys for watching. If you liked this video, if you found it helpful, if you think it's going to help beginner players cross that threshold over to being intermediate players better, faster, more effectively, more efficiently, then please subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know down in the comments, what is your strategy, right, from going from being a beginner basketball player to being more intermediate? What do you do to try to ensure that you get there as fast as you possibly can? And when you make those comments, before you do, make sure you hit that thanks button so that when you make those comments, all of your comments will stand out from all of the other comments because you hit that thanks button. Not only will that thanks button make the comment stand out, but it directly supports the channel when you hit that button. So for anybody that does hit that thanks button, know that I genuinely appreciate it. As always, like, share, comment like I said. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified whenever any video goes live on this channel. And until then, I'll see you guys next week.